Let's get back home now because housing is shaping up as one of the biggest cost of living issues in the country. It goes even beyond that. The dream of owning your own home now out of reach for a lot of Australians. National Cabinet has agreed to build more than 1 million new homes over the next 5 years. This is in a bid to tackle the housing crisis. But how are the states and territories planning to reach those targets? Joining me now is Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, great to see you. So what are the focus groups telling you? What kind of action do they want from governments of all stripes?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, we can't run a focus group on politics at the moment without talking about housing. It's definitely sort of becoming the sort of animating issue outside of immediate cost of living concerns. Folk, when you sort of engage folk in what solutions are you looking for, there's a real sort of dearth of answers. People feel the situation is so complex, it's so bad that they're not sure that there are ready answers. But one thing that does come up, is that sort of simple, sort of common sense economist that lives inside of all of us, which is, if you can address supply in a context where demand is increasing, then we should be looking at that. So the idea of building more houses is a popular one. And I think what's interesting here is when we're hearing now sort of a lot of the state governments put the emphasis on what they call infill development. This idea of building more density in those middle and inner suburbs of our major cities. And the argument being that that's where the services are, that's where the infrastructure are, it makes sense to put it there, and it does. And there's some really interesting political dimension to that as well. So in a couple of ways, it's particularly good for progressive side of politics. So when we talk to the types of folk that move into those electorates, and even the sort of the voting history over the last sort of 10 years shows this, that as you put density into those electorates, you start to see particularly safe Liberal seats become less so. And that kind of density was a big part of the story of the Teal movement. It's been a big part of the story where Labor has picked up those inner metro, middle sort of wealthier electorates from the Liberals at state and federal levels. So density in those inner suburbs has a really beneficial political effect for the progressive side of politics.
Density. Wow. Okay, so I just want to come back to, because Chris Minns kind of won the election on this, talking about, Sydney, for example, it being, like Manhattan. I always question whether people actually want to live like that, though.
This is the thing, Laura. Yeah, this is the really interesting point. Obviously, those people that live in those areas already don't particularly like it very much. And so you do get those sort of NIMBY movements. But clearly there's a demand. These apartments are filling, and it's bringing in typically younger, higher income, higher educated voters into those areas, which changes the politics of those areas. But, and this is the important but, a lot of folk that we talk to in groups don't want to live in that part of the world. They still value having a house on a block with a bit of land, a backyard, so that they can raise families. And this is particularly true, not only, but particularly true for certain sort of migrant groups. So Asian, Southeast Asian, Indian migrants, they value the bit of space to be able to raise a family. They value just having a bit of land. There's a cultural aspect to that, as not just the famous Aussie quarter acre block. Other people do feel that way as well. So that brings another political dimension into this, which is if this shift, and that's an if this shift that we're seeing to this emphasis on this middle infill kind of development comes at the cost of delivering infrastructure and services into those outer suburban areas, which will always take the bulk, just simply because of cost. The economics of it make those areas, they're always going to have greater capacity. If the infrastructure and services don't keep up, which historically they haven't been, and that's something we hear repeatedly, that's what's animating the vote out in those areas, it's what's costing Labor primary votes out in those areas as well. Those famous red wall seats, and in Victoria, those swinging marginal seats in Western Sydney become really difficult for the sitting government if that infrastructure doesn't keep up. So yes, infill, I'm sure there's town planners will tell you there's reasons for doing it. but it can't come at the expense of infrastructure and services into those outer groups, or politically there will be a huge cost to pay.
Yeah, right. So it's complicated, is what you're saying. If you had any advice to governments on how to navigate this, how to talk to people about, cost of living. I mean, we call housing, a big part of the cost of living crisis, but I think it's almost separate to that and far worse.
It's separate in a way, in the sense that it's intergenerational in a way that the immediate cost of living crisis is. I mean, most folk you speak to sort of think, look, we'll get through this immediate cost of living crisis, although conflict around the world and these sorts of things may, every time something happens, that adds sort of a length of time that we think that, we're going to be living with this cost of living crisis. But ultimately we will get through that. What they're not confident of is their kids being able to afford to buy a home. So housing has this special intergenerational kind of aspect to it that the cost of petrol right now sort of doesn't.
Right, Simon, thanks so much for that. Appreciate the positivity you're bringing this morning. But it's a truth bomb and we need to hear it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Laura.